Unholy Silence, Covering Up the Sins of the Fathers, by Father Kevin Lee. A priest's insights of what's wrong in the Catholic Church and why he just couldn't stay a priest. Dedication. This book is dedicated to my beloved parents Matthew and Margaret Lee, who gave me the gift of life and faith, and to my gorgeous wife Josephina, who gave my life meaning and for putting my faith into perspective. Quote, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory." Unquote. Matthew 12:20. Editor's Foreword. When Kevin Father Lee asked me to edit this book, I hadn't known him for very long. In fact, the first time I heard of Father Kevin Lee was on television when I watched a Channel 7 news story on 1st of May 2012 about him. Kevin had just announced to his congregation that he was a married man, and that his announcement was coinciding with the first wedding anniversary. Knowing that priests in the Catholic Church take a vow of celibacy and are not allowed to get married, I felt sorry for the man at such a happy time as his marriage, and the first anniversary of his wedding was also the day he lost his job, lost his home, and lost many of his friends. So I sent Kevin a simple message over Facebook congratulating him on his marriage. I don't normally add Facebook friends, but for some reason I decided to add Kevin as a Facebook friend that day. Normally I have a rule that I won't add anyone that I've not met or who I haven't known for a considerable amount of time online. Initially, I had no reservations about Kevin, but then as I read more about him in the newspapers and about him in Facebook groups, I confessed that I did start to have some niggling misgivings. One big one was whether it was a case of sour grapes that Kevin Lee had turned whistleblower on the church. Why hadn't he made complaints to the hierarchy if he knew of so many cases of abuse, and why only make them now? Why did Kevin link celibacy with sexual abuse of children? There are a lot of people that are celibate for a time in their lives and they don't go and abuse children, so to me that made no sense. Was he also a child abusing priest who had turned into a whistleblower because there was some sort of dirt on him? And a big question, why had he not spoken up against so many cases of child abuse if he'd known about them? After all, did not speaking up make him guilty of being an accessory after the fact for those reprehensible crimes? I had so many questions. There was something about Kevin and his ongoing indefatigable commitment to stopping child abuse. I could see very clear evidence of how hard he was working towards bringing an end to it by reading media interviews and other things online. I also believe that Kevin Lee's persistence with getting word out to the media had an important role in the federal government announcing it would hold a royal commission into child abuse that had occurred in institutions such as the Catholic Church. It was only in reading this book that I was finally able to resolve all these questions and more. As I read, I was amazed how wrong my assumptions were, which were based mainly on what I'd read in the media. I had incorrectly assumed that Kevin hadn't made complaints to the Catholic hierarchy or to the police. I was so very wrong. In fact, on reading the book, it became apparent that Kevin Lee had been an utter thorn in the side of the Catholic Church for over 20 years, from time he was a seminarian, theological student, and that he had in fact made many reports to police over the years. I must admit to feeling a bit of shame for ever in any way doubting Kevin and thinking these thoughts, but I don't think I'd be alone in thinking them, as I've also heard others voice these same questions. I was prepared to set aside my suspicions and read Kevin's book with an open mind. I really encourage you to do the same. Kevin's one aim is to help protect children and keep our children safe. I can only hope that other people take on this campaign and movement to end child abuse and protect children with the same sort of unwavering determination and courage that Kevin Lee has shown. I hope you enjoy his book and the insights he gives into the often secret life of a Catholic priest as much as I have. The Editor. I have taken the unorthodox step of choosing not to reveal my name. This is due to the fact that this book is so controversial and considered to be such a legal hot potato I have decided it is necessary to take this step. One thing I will say about myself is that I have worked tirelessly to try to end child sex abuse, and will continue to do so. Warning: this book contains subject matter unsuitable for persons under 18 years of age. It contains sexually explicit and graphic language at times which may offend. Preface: everyone knows that sexual abuse has been perpetrated with monotonous regularity by representatives of the Catholic Church, and it has been happening for centuries. But what most people don't understand is how it happens and why it continues to be concealed by the authorities within the church. Authorities who have a duty to protect the most vulnerable in their care, our children. What no one wants to consider is the proposition that the church has established the very educational and residential institutions that have allowed the abuse to happen and staffed those institutions with members who are likely to be abusers. Although most would recognize that forcing its members to refrain from sexual intimacy would have to be the most extreme form of repression, no one wants to accept the fact that compulsory celibacy is contributing to the problem. Because there have been many opposing views about the sexual abuse crisis and those who are most likely to be perpetrators of it, I have attempted to clear the confusion. As with all organizational incompetence, the blame must be laid with the head. In the case of the Roman Catholic Church, the recently resigned 85-year-old pontiff, Pope Benedict XVI, must surely take responsibility for the atrocious indifference that has been shown by his church to the increasing allegations of institutional negligence in dealing with instances of sexual abuse. It has been widely suggested that Pope Benedict XVI was not competent to lead such a powerful institution, and his views were at variance with most of his own academics who have assessed his performance. As late as 20th September 2010, Pope Benedict XVI stunned a gathering of prelates when he claimed that the sexual attraction of men to children wasn't considered an absolute evil as recently as the 1970s. In his traditional Christmas address to cardinals and officials working in Rome, Pope Benedict XVI also claimed that child pornography was increasingly considered normal by society. Quote, in the 1970s, pedophilia was theorized as something fully in conformity with man and even with children, unquote, the Pope said. Quote, it was maintained, even within the realm of Catholic theology, that there is no such thing as evil in itself or good in itself. There is only a better than and a worse than. Nothing is good or bad in itself, unquote. Pope Benedict XVI admitted abuse revelations in 2010 reached an unimaginable dimension which brought humiliation on the church. Catholics should have been embarrassed to hear their Pope talk again and again about abuse while doing little or nothing to stop it and to mischaracterize this heinous crisis. He continued to criticize areas of society that he can't influence while failing to change the structures under his control. The long-standing unhealthy culture of a rigid, secretive, all-male church hierarchy fixated on self-preservation at all costs. With the top man in the church holding views like that, you certainly begin to understand the root of the problem is the understanding of sexuality by men who have promised to refrain from sexual intimacy for the whole of their life. The main reason I felt compelled to publish the accounts of the shocking stories you are about to read is out of frustration at constantly hearing the parents, partners, or siblings of abuse victims relate the sad experiences of these previously good Catholic children, having committed suicide or indulged in mind-numbing drug addictions as a result of having been sexually assaulted by a member of the clergy. Indoctrinated in everything the church officially told me, I used to routinely dismiss these complaints as one-off or rare occurrences. I defended the church by maintaining that the good that we did far outweighed the infrequent harm done by these very few bad apples. But over time, these rare occasions seemed to multiply. I was hearing about priestly sexual indiscretions with alarming frequency while church officials continued insisting on their rarity. In a rush to burnish its image in Australia in the light of frequent accusations, the bishops have chosen not justice for the victims, but harm minimization. They are not concerned about preventing the damage of the lives of church members, but only further damage to its already tarnished reputation. They created committees whose only measurable outcomes have been carefully worded church-speak documents outlining what will be done in the future to prevent opportunities for abuse from occurring. Impotent committee-generated manuals such as Towards Healing and Integrity in Ministry are the result of years of academic workshops and meetings aimed at heading off the allegations that bishops did nothing to prevent pedophiles from continuing to hide behind the righteousness of their priesthood. Year after year, I would follow the church protocols for dealing with complaints of sexual abuse and report them to the hierarchy, only to find that time after time, these allegations were denied as ever having been passed on to the hierarchy or dismissed without proper investigation, or brushed under the carpet. The continual stream of bump has not resulted in the discovery of one single offender, which adds to the suspicion that the church is not really intent on ending the abuse. Whenever I accuse the church officials that they have done little practically to stem the flow of abusers entering the ministry, they directed me to those documents. "We are doing something," one bishop protested. "We are producing documents telling priests what they should not do." Any number of laws will not stop crimes from being committed. In the same way, any number of documents telling priests what they shouldn't do does nothing to stop them doing it. Eventually, my own failure to keep my vow of celibacy reinforced for me what everyone else had always told me. Celibacy is impossible. But despite this awareness, I kept up the pretense that it was, because by that stage I was completely entrenched in the institution and enjoying the privileges that my priestly position offered. But the final straw came for me one day after confessing my own failure to live celibately. I went to confession in an area would not be known to an old Italian padre with a reputation for sanctity. After identifying myself as a priest, I admitted I had been passionately kissing my girlfriend, the one who was later to become my wife. "What?" he yelled. "You are a priest! You are not allowed to have a girlfriend!" I was immediately aware that his loud shouting could be heard by the other penitents waiting outside. "It's priests like you who bring the church into such disrepute," he spat venomously at me. "Yes, Father, I know that," I whispered in an attempt to quieten his shouting. "I'm sorry, Father," I said, stumbling for a justifying response. He continued to tell me how evil I was, and accused me of having allowed the devil into my soul by engaging in physical contact with this woman. "Yes, I am so sorry, Father." I began to get frustrated. "I know, that's why I am here in confession, telling God I am sorry." After berating me noisily for several more minutes for the scandalous life I was living, the elderly Italian priest suddenly changed his tone. "All right then, make a good act of contrition and pray the rosary for your penance." "Yes, Father," I meekly replied, and proceeded to pray the penitent's prayer as he recited the words of absolution in Latin. When I had finished my act of contrition, I stood to leave, but the priest held out his hand to stop me, then asked me, "Have you got time to hear my confession?" I was surprised by the strangely unorthodox request, but nodded a compliant, "Yes, Father." He handed me the purple priest's stole he was wearing over his shoulders, and he said in a much more subdued voice, "I don't think I ever confessed this, and it is bothering me. There is a family I am very close to in this parish. In fact, I have married the parents and baptized all the kids. I come to their house regularly for meals, you know. Once I was watching TV with the family. I had the youngest daughter sitting on my lap. She couldn't be more than 7 years old. He then told me he had digitally penetrated the little girl while the other family members were obviously watching TV. The image of what he had verbalized caused me to gag with nausea as I spoke the words of absolution. It was the most horrible confession I have heard. People to whom I have confided that story have asked in disbelief, "Why did you forgive him?" I have to admit that it was with my great reluctance that I did, but I had to because he knew my sins. But that was not the first or only time priests have confessed to me their deviances from what most would expect of a person occupying the esteemed and privileged position of Catholic priest. This book is filled with further examples which will horrify you as much as they have traumatized me. It has been a constant source of embarrassment for me every time I opened a newspaper to read of yet another case of priestly sexual abuse. Whenever I did hear a news bulletin begin with the words, "A priest has been charged," and then outline something awful that had been done, I secretly hoped he was an Anglican. But the Catholic Church has always smugly evaded public condemnation of its priests with the blatant denial that it had any knowledge of these offenses prior to the arrests announced by police. How did the police seem to discover all the evidence necessary to convict a priest of sexual abuse, while its own superiors, often living under the same roof, claim to have absolutely no knowledge of his deviant activities? My own frustration with the immovable authority structures of the church has helped me to understand why so many people have vacated churches over the decades. I have begun to comprehend how previously staunch Christians can now admit to having lost their faith in God and even doubted the existence of heaven. I have joined my voice to those many sincere Catholics who constantly question God concerning the fate of victims of sexual abuse by religious people. How can you allow this sort of thing to happen in your name, and why don't you do anything to stop it? I have never heard a verbal response, but I posit one for myself. I have done something about it. I made you. And God has certainly given me some insights that most have not had access to. I have been privy to information and events that most are ignorant of. I have seen firsthand the process of abuse, concealment, and the shifting of blame. Only once is it recorded that Jesus endorsed the killing of someone for doing something wrong. It is when he said, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for him if, with a heavy millstone hung around his neck, he had been cast into the sea." Mark 9:42. According to Jesus, those who commit crimes against children and turn them away from God deserve an early termination to their lives. They are the only sinners for whose sin there is no divine forgiveness affordable. It is these men who will be held accountable for these souls whose lives they have destroyed. But it is not good enough to wait for God to exact his vengeance. The men who are responsible for the employment of pedophiles and sex abusers should also share in his divine retribution, and according to me and many others, they deserve a fair chunk of it while they are alive. I am not the first person to identify serious flaws in the way the Catholic Church deals with allegations of sexual abuse, that priests are living double lives and contradictions are apparent in the way they actually live compared with the way they profess to live, is not in dispute. In her scandalous but barely read 2005 book, Priests in Love, Jane Anderson makes an admission to widespread sexual infidelity amongst Australian Catholic clergy. The author surveyed thousands of priests, promised anonymity, and presented a compendium of confessions from men who have turned their back on mandatory celibacy to follow their own consciences. However, her revelations highlight the fact that there are a significant number of Australian clerics who are not living faithfully the promises they made on their ordinations. Their infidelity authorizes other deviates to abuse the sacred trust that the Church empowers them with. My book will explain how the enormous responsibility that the Church bestows on priests also makes the priesthood an inviting career for pedophiles and those with sexual deviancies. The shroud of celibacy becomes the cloak that hides a multitude of sins. The publicly promoted premise behind the insistence on clerical celibacy is that the priest needed to be as pure and spotless as the offerings that he handled at the altar. A vow of chastity was what qualified a man to hold such an esteemed leadership position within the Church. Of course, to maintain this facade, the priest must at least appear to be chaste, even if he is not. Bishops responsible for the management of local church communities rely on a number of such men willing to wear the vestments and celebrate the Mass. The bishops will never pry into the priest's personal life to determine whether or not he is celibate, for fear of finding out to the contrary. With a decline in the number of people willing to become priests and not enough priests to staff the Catholic churches within Australia, the bishops are desperate to hold onto the priests that they have within their ranks. Today, in Catholic parishes throughout the world, and particularly in Australia, men are pretending to be celibate in order to hold the exalted office of priest. They are keeping up the image of a church that is losing its relevance in secular society. If it were not for its expansive school system and the government grants sustaining them, the Catholic Church would have died out long ago. The ongoing financial success and academic leadership of Catholic schools are propping up the Church's flagging identity and topping up the Church coffers, depleted after endless sexual abuse compensation payouts. But the Church still needs to have enough men willing to celebrate the Sunday Mass to give the impression that it is business as usual. It doesn't matter whether or not these men are in fact celibate, as long as they look like they are. I should know, I was one of them. Introduction. In case you are tempted to think that I am just another disenchanted, rebellious, or failed pastor, attempting to justify myself by slinging mud at other priests, let me say without humility that I have sacrificed a huge amount of kudos by writing this book. Until recently, I was the parish priest of the fastest growing Catholic community in New South Wales. I established a new parish at Glenmore Park and supervised the funding and construction of an architectural award-winning church building now valued at over $5 million. The parish, land, properties, and assets I was responsible for are valued close to $10 million. Along with the responsibility of over 600 primary school children and close to 1,000 girls in our neighboring high school, I was chaplain to a large Christian Brothers boys' high school and dean of our region's priests. I was on the council of priests for the diocese and on the board of Catholic Care Social Services, both prestigious appointments given me by the diocesan bishop. In 2000, I had the honor of being a chaplain to the athletes during the Sydney Olympic Games and was also distinguished. In 2000, I had the honor of being a chaplain to the athletes during the Sydney Olympic Games and was also distinguished with the honor of being the region's Catholic police chaplain for nearly 15 years, having had appointments to various diocesan committees. Being selected for these tasks and positions of leadership inferred experience, competence, and trustworthiness. Being selected for these tasks and positions of leadership inferred experience, competence, and trustworthiness, all of which doesn't prove a thing about my virtue or ability, only that someone in the hierarchy valued myself and my work highly enough to place these enormous responsibilities on me. But reputation and rank are not something that is sought in priesthood. I would rather be remembered for having made a difference in people's lives by bringing them closer to Jesus. On October 17, 2010, 8,000 Australian Catholics were amongst the hundreds of thousands crowded into St. Peter's Square in Rome in collective euphoria as they awaited Pope Benedict XVI canonization of our first national saint. Most lay people in the church were unaware that this day might never have happened. If the upper echelon had their way, Mary MacKillop's name would have remained suppressed along with her order, the Sister of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. A few days earlier, the ABC's Compass program revealed that in 1871, at the time of her leadership in the Order of A few days earlier, the ABC's Compass program revealed that in 1871, at the time of her leadership in the Order of Mary MacKillop's Josephites, as they were known colloquially, sisters attracted the ire of the hierarchy by revealing that Father Keating of Kapunda, South Australia, was molesting children at the local church school. The sisters reported the abuse to the Vicar General and disciplinary action was taken against Father Keating. Humiliating him and angering his friend, Father Charles Horan, who was close to the then boss of Adelaide Catholic Diocese, Bishop Lawrence Shield. Father Horan is believed to have harbored a grudge against Sister Mary MacKillop and the other whistleblowers in her order, and used his influence over Bishop Shield to manipulate him into throwing the nun out of the church in 1871. Bishop Shield's conscience must have plagued him because he reversed her excommunication on his deathbed. If Father Horan had his way, Sister Mary MacKillop would still be silenced by excommunication. What was her sin? Wishing to uncover and prevent the continuation of the crimes of a pedophile priest. Mary MacKillop had become aware of the awful activities of a man who had been entrusted with the spiritual lives of the young and vulnerable and had tried to prevent him. Sadly, many others, including myself, have experienced the same opposition and excommunication when they attempted to expose the dark secrets of priests. Pedophilia continues unabated amongst the clergy in the Catholic Church, largely fueled by the secrecy that surrounds the personal lives and activities of priests. St. Mary MacKillop would be oscillating in her North Sydney grave if she knew, as I am sure she does, that the very church that canonized her is continuing to endorse the proliferation of these heinous crimes against children and doing very little to discourage future abuses. As you get further into this book, you will hear of terrible examples of the Catholic Church's systemic process of concealing abuses, a process which is evident to everyone else but themselves. You will also notice that women are removed from the possibility of leadership in the church as they pose a threat to the male-dominated structures which permit pedophilia to flourish. Religious women who have followed in St. Mary's active service among the more vulnerable in Sydney society continue to work for restorative justice by seeking equality in the church. But the blatantly misogynist hierarchy has persisted in its opposition to women's rights to leadership in the church on flimsy theologically chauvinistic arguments. There are many more suffragists petitioning the church to give women equal access to priestly ordination, but the subject has been officially closed by the Vatican in a decree of 1994. In an apostolic letter on reserving priestly ordination to men alone, the then Pope John Paul II said the church's ban on women priests is definitive and not open to debate among Catholics. Since that time, a further encyclical general decree regarding the delict of attempted sacred ordination of a woman was published in June 2008 and has given the threat of excommunication to any bishop who attempts to ordain a woman as priest. A Vatican spokesman, there are notably no spokeswomen, Father De Noia said, "The decree makes clear the fact that the people directly involved in an attempted ordination of a woman excommunicate themselves automatically. It is not a penalty imposed by the local bishop or the universal church. In stating it this way, the church attempts to exonerate itself of any discrimination by saying the person excommunicated himself, not by the action of the church. It's really a chicken or egg question." There is a story I have used as a parable with children in an attempt to explain how we chose whether we ultimately become good or bad. An old man was attempting to encourage his wayward grandson by admitting to mistakes he had made in his own life. "In my life, I have done many bad things and many good things. It is because inside me there is a bad bear and a good bear. The bad bear causes me to do bad things, and the good bear causes me to do good things." The little boy asked, "So who wins in the end, Grandpa?" "Whichever one I feed," the old man answered. Many would recognize in themselves a tendency to sometimes do wrong, even though the predominant tendency is to do good. We take things home from work, download pirated music or movies, exceed the speed limit, exaggerate exemptable items on a tax return. But we wouldn't steal a car or kill someone. The difficulty people have in believing that priests sexually abuse vulnerable people or children is because they attribute to priests a holiness that is not realistic. We want to believe that priests are always doing good and could never do the opposite. People want to believe that priests are programmed differently from other mortals. We assume priests are somehow immune from the more base human tendencies. They are above the temptations and impulses that cause us to act in a way contrary to our nature. Priests are altruistic superhumans, and it is precisely this belief that allows us to bestow so much of our trust in priests. In my time as a chaplain with the NSW police, I was sometimes asked to give supporting testimony during trials for offenses that I had witnessed, merely by having been in the police vehicle at the time when an alleged offender was apprehended. Sometimes those who are arrested and charged with offenses attempt to claim innocence of the crime after speaking with a lawyer. I remember once being a witness in court for the police who were prosecuting a car thief. At the time he was arrested, he claimed not to have been the driver of the car when the officers arrested him, as he had left the vehicle and hidden in a clothing store. I had been in the police vehicle when the officer gave chase and ultimately arrested the thief who had left the stolen car when the police tackled him. I had clearly seen him running from the vehicle and was able to identify him in the store by the distinctive clothing he wore. When the time came for me to give my testimony, the defense lawyer began his cross-examination. I suggested to you, Father Lee, that you could be fabricating this evidence to support your police colleague here, who didn't in fact get a clearer view of the assailant. The magistrate irritably intervened before I even had a chance to open my mouth in surprise at the accusation. Now hold it right there, Mr. Smith. If you are daring to question the integrity of a Catholic priest, you are treading on very thin ice. The solicitor immediately withdrew his suggestion, and the criminal was ultimately sentenced to 18 months jail. This lawyer and the magistrate were obviously Catholic school educated. They were too indoctrinated in the philosophy that the priest is always truthful. This belief in priestly infallibility contributes to the cause of many priests going astray. The priest himself starts to believe that they are what people think of them. Some priests thrive on the adulation and exaltation that their parishioners bestow upon them. They believe that they are someone special and expect special treatment. Consequently, they even expect to get away with an arrogance that most ordinary people would be condemned for.